We ended that last video with the Camera Raw filter opened, so I'm going to double click on that just to get back to the same place we were at when that last video ended, and now the fun begins. The first thing I would encourage you to try is to click the auto button. Sometimes it's great, sometimes not so much, but it will give you some information. So when that's clicked, you see the changes that were made, and we've really got an area that's completely blown out right here. So that's not great. But look, the exposure went down, and if you wonder what exposure does, hey, look, darker, lighter, okay? And you can blow this out completely. So that's not great. We'll click on auto again to reset that. The contrast, what does contrast do? You play around with these sliders in order to understand what's happening, and you can go all the way down this list in order to see that. I'm going to click back on default because I don't want to accept that. I find that with these type of geometric images where we have areas of solid color and overlap where the transparency is giving us blended colors from the multiple layers of these squares and rectangles, that clarity seems to be a cool place to start. And if you crank it up a little bit, you can see what it's doing. And if you ever want to check the letter P, kind of think of P for preview. There's before any changes, there's after. So the letter P, especially when you get further into this, can work really well. For this particular image, dragging clarity all the way doesn't harm anything. And we hit P, you can see it actually adds a little visual interest. The dancing partner for clarity is down here in the effects channel. So if we click on effects, dehaze, if you start cranking this to right, notice that it does what clarity does. It adds the more contrast, more of the gradient-like effect that you see being laid down. And drag this back and forth. You're looking for some happy medium, and that's more than I had in the example I showed you at the beginning. Let's just see what happens with this, because we can always change this. This is all non-destructive. Because we got this area right here that's just so blown out, let's come into the HSL grayscale channel, click on that, and I think by default you're in hue. Go ahead, come over to luminance, and let's change the luminance of the purples here. Let's drag it down, make them much lighter, and see how this is becoming less of a blob of color and more an interesting collection of colors. And then we can do the same thing with the magentas, play around, look around. You can always drag it all the way to the right, all the way to the left, and look and see what it's affecting. And what it's affecting most, you may want to, I've noticed that it was really playing with that guy. Same thing with the other channels. Start dragging these back and forth. There's no real perfect setting. Every picture's different, and your taste is different than mine. So play around with these. I'm going to go ahead and stop there because it's not really stopping. It's just pausing. And then come back to the basic channel, and let's see what happens with exposure. Where do we want to go? This is all, you want to avoid areas that get completely blown out or, in either light or dark. So you find your happy medium and drag the sliders back and forth to see what you like. And it helps. You don't necessarily have to click on this. If you go over the word, see the double-headed arrow that appears? You can pull this back and forth, and you just are seasoning to taste. It's kind of like cooking, except it's much more forgiving. If you put too much salt in, you can always take it back out. That's not true in the kitchen. So vibrance, pumping up vibrance just blows out these pinks. Sometimes taking it down a little bit, as counterintuitive as that is, can work really nicely. And same thing with the saturation. Sometimes pulling it down, the colors get a little more harmonious. Okay, we do have areas of dark here, areas of light here. We're not looking for consistent values all the way across in tone. But if we click OK, now we have our before and after. You can just click on this eyeball to see what was before. That's what we started with, and it looks quite a bit different now, doesn't it? And that's where we are now as soon as this loads. The cool thing about these filters, because we're working with smart objects, let's say, hey, I'd like to take that magenta down just a little bit more. We double click on the camera raw. On the filter, it opens back up. We can come to the HSL sliders, pump that down a little bit, maybe even come into the hue. And what happens here in the magentas if we move that a little towards red? Yeah, it's only affecting highlights, so I'm going to hit Command Z and not do anything with that. Same thing with saturation. You have control over individual colors. So we can crank those purples down a little bit, and maybe that works okay. So there's a good stopping point, and because I want to save this as just an example of camera raw, excuse me, we've already saved this as an O1 file, so I'm going to hit Command S in order to save that. And you know what? Let's just leave it at O1. We'll come back and I'll show you some more tricks we can do with this same file, and we'll still have preserved this state because we're working with smart objects.